So thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion. My name is Nathaniel Edmonds. I am the Vice Chair of the White Collar Crime Subcommittee of the Criminal Justice Section. And with me are three representatives of the U.S. Department of Justice to talk about different white collar enforcement priorities in the coming year. So we very much appreciate the opportunity to share their thoughts on what is going on. We also welcome any questions that you might have. So a little background on me. I'm a partner in the law firm of Paul Hastings here in Washington, D.C. I've been there about 10 years. I focus on international criminal matters. Prior to that, I spent 10 years at the Criminal Division Fraud Section, where I started as an honors attorney shortly after clerking. So I will let the panel introduce themselves, starting with David Lim.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to meet you all and be here today. My name is David Lim, and you get a 2-for-1 with me today. I have two roles. One is currently as the co-director of Task Force Klepto Capture. We're most famously known as the people that are seizing yachts and planes belonging to Russian elites and oligarchs. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the work that we're doing, the priorities that we have moving forward as this conflict continues to wage on. But my home office is the Counterintelligence and Export Control Section of the National Security Division of DOJ. We have a variety of different mandates to include prosecuting espionage cases, which includes mishandling of classified information. We're also the office that supervises and in partnership with our U.S. Attorney's Office partners, prosecutes sanctions cases, export control cases, and foreign malign cases. I started my career at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, so I have the benefit of it coming from both worlds at the state level and at the federal. And I'm happy to share about my experience in both, the similarities as well as the contrasts. I'll look forward to the Q&A session.
Alan Medina.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Medina, the Senior Deputy Chief in the Fraud Section Criminal Division. We're not, what you mentioned a moment ago, where we overlap for a period of time. The Fraud Section itself, we are about 200 federal prosecutors and support staff, a far cry from when I started, which was where we were about 40 or so prosecutors. So in over a decade, we've expanded a bit. There are three litigating units in the fraud section: the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act (FCPA) section, our unit, the Healthcare Fraud Unit, and the Market Integrity Major Frauds Unit. We'll get into a little bit of the details about that in a moment. So I've been here a little over a decade, as I mentioned. I used to be, prior to the Senior Deputy Chief role that I have, I was the Healthcare Fraud Unit Chief for 3 years, which began right at the beginning of COVID, so unique challenges to that. And before that, I was a trial attorney in the Healthcare Fraud Unit, where I prosecuted cases throughout the country, primarily in the healthcare fraud space, but I'd also worked on other investigations along the way, including FCPA and some securities fraud matters. So I'm happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
And Alden.
I'm Alden Pelker. I'm the Deputy Director of the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team, which is a fairly new team at DOJ, which was stood up in early 2022 to focus the department's efforts around cryptocurrency facilitated criminal activity. So we are a group of just over 20 prosecutors drawn from various components at Main Justice, including the Fraud Section, the National Security Division, the Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, and my prior home section, the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section, or CCIPS, to draw from those different areas of expertise, as well as a number of attorneys who are still located out at U.S. Attorney's offices around the country. The idea of the team is to bring together the department's top experts on cryptocurrency related activities and crime, each one bringing in different areas of expertise. So with expertise in hacking, and expertise in money laundering, and expertise in fraud cases or national security cases, and serve as a focal point for the department, both to partner on investigations and prosecutions, as well as help to coordinate and enhance the department's efforts around the country and engagement in our domestic and international law enforcement partners.
So what you can see here is that we've got a number of kind of DC specific and DC unique type of white collar cases. We did not think that this would be the best use to talk about some of the U.S. attorney's offices or some of the district attorneys, state's attorneys' prosecutions, but to really give you kind of the unique DC perspective, staying away from some of the more political cases, which are also a DC specialty, but we did not want to spend the time talking about that today. So what we wanted to do is really have an opportunity for each of these different major litigating units to really give you an opportunity to hear about what they do, what their priorities are, what their policy goals are, and kind of what the life is of a prosecutor in that, and how the cases come in, how they evolve, which ones end up in trial, which ones end up in pleas, so that you can get a sense a little bit of the work that they do. It may be very different than the typical practice that you guys see, but it's a critically important part of the justice system, and it's a critically important part, I think, also to be aware of in the spirit of what this aspect of the Fall Institute is about, which is talking about equity. And one of the pieces we want to get to is thinking about the role of defense lawyers from a prosecutor's perspective as well. So with that, I would love to kind of hear from each one of you, number of cases that your section handles the year, types of cases, right? Going after assets, going after individuals, going after corporations. Why don't we start with David and kind of give a sense, besides just grabbing yachts, what is it that you guys do in different ways?
So I think I'll start off by talking about the Counterintelligence and Export Control Section, CES, and how that mission and mandate to focus on foreign threats really was one of kind of the focal points and genesis of the task force after Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine. But CES is one of two litigating components within the National Security Section, the other being the Counterterrorism Section. Both of us have the mandate to really utilize all criminal tools to achieve national security goals, protect the homeland, with two very different mandates. And so on CES's side, we have multiple dozens of cases that come in on a yearly basis. Given the nature of the work and our extensive collaboration with the U.S. intelligence community, something that is a bit unique to other litigating components within the Justice Department, we have a number of leads that come in directly from our USIC partners, from our law enforcement partners, and all the other traditional ways that you would think about prosecutors developing cases. So
USIC is U.S. Intelligence Community.
U.S. Intelligence Community. And those are your law enforcement sources. There are things that we see in the media, things that we read about, hear about, and pique our interest and we dive in. As I talked about at the outset, our buckets are kind of divided into three different mandates within CES. You've got the counterintelligence bucket, which works on anything ranging from foreign spies, intelligence officers who are here in the United States trying to achieve malign goals. You have foreign state actors, and that's kind of important to distinguish between my colleague at CSIPS, where we both look at the thefts of foreign actors or domestic actors to steal U.S. technology. But when a foreign country is behind the scenes in directing or controlling actors to try to steal U.S. technology so that they can take that back to their homeland for a competitive advantage, that's something that we investigate within CES. And of course, the mishandling of classified information. If you are someone that has access to classified information, or you're not supposed to have access to classified information, and nonetheless it somehow appears somewhere where it shouldn't, that is the office that is looking at this in partnership again with the U.S. Attorney's Office community. The second bucket is similar in context but a bit different. It is our Foreign Agent Registration Act unit. It is the Foreign Malign Influence. I would kind of, in the most simplest of terms, define their mandate as anything that is expansive beyond just foreign governments. They're really looking at our foreign principles, and that can mean foreign persons, foreign businessmen. Are they trying to influence the way that we as Americans are thinking about issues, our politicians as they vote on issues, and seeking both civil and criminal remedies whenever we find and identify those at fault in that area? And the third is the export control and sanctions, which has been my primary focus for the last 5 years. In simplest of terms, that is to ensure that we are protecting our most sensitive technologies as well as any other technology that we deem as a government should be regulated. As you can imagine, we have a vested interest in ensuring that our goods don't go to places to be used for purposes that are against and contrary to our national interests, our allies' interests. And so we do a lot of prosecution on that front to ensure that we have visibility into where it's going. And now thanks for that, sorry about that. Hopefully you heard all that.
We're not gonna start it over.
I don't even know what I said until at this point. And then economic sanctions, which has been a hot topic these past 2 years. That's in partnership with our colleagues at the Treasury Department and the State Department, who have the authority to designate or to effectively make radioactive foreign persons, foreign entities who have, acted in ways that are contrary to the U.S. national security and foreign policy objectives. And they're cut off from financial institutions that we all safeguard in our own ways, and they're prevented from U.S. persons, both companies and individuals, providing services to them.
One question, you mentioned partners at Treasury, partners at Commerce. What is the role of civil versus criminal sanctions in the national security world?
Absolutely. So my mandate, both under klepto capture as well as in CES, is to enforce the criminal side. We have, I think, the most distinguishing factors, if we're looking at the same fact pattern as Treasury or as DOJ, is the legal threshold that we're dealing with. And so in my world, we have the additional task of proving that there was an awareness of some type of legal obligation to register, to get licenses in order, or permissions to do things before you act or send things overseas, but you chose not to do it despite knowing that. And that, as you can imagine, that's one of our most significant challenges. We can demonstrate that this person, this company, definitely sent this item to a country, to an entity that they shouldn't. Proving that they knew they couldn't, that's the difference between us on the criminal side and the civil side. Civil side, my colleagues at OFAC, they get to work with strict liability. The fact that there is an act does it all. And that's why it's important. I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen in the last 2 years, especially in the Russia front, is this deeper collaboration with our civil regulatory partners. We're not always going to be able to bring criminal indictments. There are legitimate limitations to what we can do. And the more rapidly we bring them in at the outset, the more closely we are coordinated as we have our parallel investigations, the greater chance that there is some type of disruption at the end of the day. And so that if DOJ is not able to pursue criminal charges, get people extradited here, that our partners in the civil side are able to levy and respond in kind with very significant financial penalties.
Great, thank you. Why don't we go over to Alden next, and I'll circle back to Alan afterwards to kind of talk about CNET. You'll bring it all together. And CNET and CSIPs in terms of the work that you guys do.
Sure. So NSET, as I mentioned, is this multidisciplinary team with a really broad area of focus. We touch on any type of underlying crime where the use of cryptocurrency is integral to the offense, and for our team to take it on has to be particularly sophisticated, something where our added expertise is going to be what helps move that case forward. But the underlying violation may vary. So we have a large body of cases that involve the hacks of large financial institutions that are dealing in cryptocurrency. And this has been a particularly pernicious problem over the past few years, where a single exploit or hack can lead to losses in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. And the targets there may be a particular financial institution like a virtual currency exchange, or maybe what's known as a DeFi platform or decentralized finance platform. A similar sort of concept, but where the exploit may be a code vulnerability. And we have the in-house expertise working with law enforcement to be able to start to delve into looking not just at the actual exploit or the hack itself, but also try to assist with asset recovery, which is a big focus in our line of work. On the other side, we also have a large volume of cases that deal with what at initial blush appear to be kind of your more run-of-the-mill fraud cases. So if any of you have recently received a text message by someone that claims to have the wrong number, there's a very good chance that that is actually the initial stage of what's known as a crypto confidence scheme, colloquially called pig butchering. And if you respond in to these text messages, what will happen is that you may be roped into a multi-week, multi-month conversation with a very sophisticated organized crime group that is running these networks of scammers who will develop a relationship with you and wait until that relationship is developed until they drop in fairly initially subtle tidbits that will end up really defrauding even very, very sophisticated individuals of mentioning, hey, my cousin was using this cryptocurrency trading app, and the name of the website may look very much like an actual legitimate cryptocurrency trading platform, or a romance scam where they are asking for the victim to send them some form of money, but months into developing this relationship. And while those initially at first blush may appear to be kind of smaller scale fraud schemes, what our group is able to do is we look at those networks and see, following where the money goes, is see that they're often tied into large organized groups that are able to defraud victims to the tune of tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. And we are able to use and leverage our expertise and our engagement with U.S. attorneys' offices around the country to be able to put those pieces together and better understand where the money is going, and use that to inform our understanding of the network and how we would bring further investigative action and ultimate prosecutions. And along all of this is really a common thread that much of what we do, regardless of the underlying crime, relates to following the money and using our group's expertise focusing on cryptocurrency to be able to really leverage that as an aspect of our investigation. Which brings us to one of the main focus points for enforcement by NCET, which is looking at the money laundering facilitators. Because what we see is we're working a broad, diverse array of underlying crimes, is that often the criminals end up using the same types of platforms to help in their money laundering activity, to help make it harder for us as law enforcement to be able to trace the funds, to identify who's committing the offenses, and to be able to actually recover the funds and give them back to the victims who lost them in the first place. And so when we look at all of these different money laundering facilitators, sometimes they're complicit exchanges, sometimes they're standalone money laundering services marketed specifically to criminals. And we actually target those as areas for investigation and prosecution to try and figure out who's running them and how do we appropriately disrupt them.
Talent.
Yeah, so, when I mentioned earlier, I'll try to weave this together. As Senior Deputy Chief in the fraud section, right, the term in and of itself is very broad. We are, I believe, it stands as the largest litigating unit at Maine Justice, in the Department of Justice, talking about close to 200 federal prosecutors. When you look at what we do, we have our hands in a bit of almost everything you've heard so far, but each individual unit, and I'll talk about that briefly, has its own particular mandate. And we collaborate with one another, and we collaborate with each other, foreign authorities, local agencies, sometimes even state entities as well. So I mentioned at the outset 3 litigating units, the first of which is the FCPA unit. This unit is comprised of approximately 35 to 40 prosecutors, and their role is to look into investigations involving foreign bribery, government officials abroad, usually with the use of third-party intermediaries to bribe officials in order to obtain a certain benefit. That's a very simplistic term, but that is what these prosecutors do on a day-to-day basis, and they prosecute these cases all around the country. The healthcare fraud unit, you might say, well, they prosecute and investigate healthcare fraud. About 10 years ago, the explanation is probably that simple. 10 years ago, you're looking at 30 or so prosecutors really just charging healthcare fraud generally. Nowadays, we have close to 80 prosecutors, which is the largest unit in the fraud section, that are part of what we call strike forces. The first one was established in around 2006 down in Miami, Florida, and we've expanded across the country into about 27 federal districts nationwide. In 2020, though, we learned that notwithstanding the areas that we're in, the Miamis, Brooklyn, Los Angeles, knowing that we were in the right places, a lot of the fraud is there. With the advent of increased technologies like telemedicine, we found out that a doctor or a Medicare provider or medical professional could be stationed in one state and have an effect on patients all across the country. And what were we going to do about it, right? Oftentimes the crimes were in San Francisco or Nebraska, places we didn't have a foothold. So in 2020, we created what's called the National Rapid Response Team, which is based here in DC, that have prosecuted cases in those areas we weren't traditionally located. But they focus on complex healthcare fraud as well as opioid related schemes. They also charge a significant number of cases involving money laundering. When I heard follow the money, my ears perked up, because I think across the board, fraud is, I've said to juries, lies for money. Well, you need to figure out where that money is. And we expend a lot of resources on that alone. And not just FCPA, healthcare fraud, but our market integrity unit, which if it's not FCPA, if it's not healthcare fraud, our market integrity unit is looking at everything in between. That includes program bribery, so like procurement fraud schemes, cryptocurrency schemes, securities and commodities fraud schemes. The 40 or so prosecutors that are in that unit are focusing on those schemes. And one unifying trait that each one of those units have or are utilizing is data. The healthcare fraud unit was by far the first unit within the fraud section to take advantage of data analytics. That unit in and of itself has a team of 10 individuals, some financial analysts, others who can look at claims data, and everything in between, are more proactive in identifying schemes that we need to prosecute. Our market integrity unit, our FCPA unit, are now focusing on the use of data analytics, not just on the back end to follow the money, but to identify trends in the market or trends in schemes that we see throughout the country to be more efficient in what we do. So we're utilizing data across the board. One other unit that I'd mention here is our corporate enforcement, compliance, and policy unit. At a very high level, we focus a lot on corporate fraud with individual prosecutions. This unit's specialty is to provide guidance and input involving corporate fraud. So various policies that come out, they meet with defense counsel, they work with our teams that are in-house, and oftentimes work with counsel coming in when presentations come up in a variety of schemes. So wide mandate, complex cases, and also cases that require our expertise and resources that maybe a local U.S. Attorney's Office are unable to do and maybe ask us to join. We do a lot of cases locally as well.
In criminal law, right, there are different theories of why you prosecute cases, right? There's deterrence, right, general and specific. There is incapacitation. There is rehabilitation, retribution. You also have restitution, restorative justice. In your types of cases, what are the main purposes of criminal prosecution, or what are some of the policy goals that you think your types of cases pursue?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that was just brought up right now is corporate enforcement. And obviously, when you think about the fraud section, even when you think about NSET and the platforms that they're investigating, you naturally gravitate towards, and you kind of put the pieces together. It makes sense. Of course, they would be looking at corporate entities. That's something that the Deputy Attorney General has harped on when we're looking at the national security threat as well. And over the last year or so, you've seen an increase in focus, and it certainly now is a central priority for the National Security Division to look at corporate actors to ensure that their behaviors are in line with our national security interest. And so there, the goal, when we're talking about what the motivation is for that centralization, is to change and create a culture of compliance. When you're talking about entities who manufacture sensitive technology, when you're talking about financial institutions who are in the process of processing the overwhelming majority of financial transactions that any individual or entity on the globe are processing, we want to ensure that the compliance program are keeping watch to ensure that they are not accidentally allowing their mechanisms, their services, their goods to be used by bad actors. It's certainly something that I have focused on predominantly on the task force for the last 2 years. The task force's creation was simply to marshal the department's resources in a coordinated way to leverage all of the criminal tools that we have in the export control and sanctions space to ensure that Russia, its military, its government, is not getting access to more money to be able to fund their war, not getting the goods to be able to build the missiles that are being used against civilians in Ukraine. And this is a common theme that I think throughout the department, not just in the National Security Division, that we share. Follow the money is absolutely right. The platforms that a lot of these people are using are, I suspect, within the ambit of what the NSET team is looking at, as well as the fraud section in all of the angles that they're looking at with respect to different ways in which corporate bad actors are navigating this space. And so, I've talked a little bit about the priorities, but I think these are shared goals that we have across the board here.
And so it sounds a little bit like it's both a deterrence and an incapacitation, right? Like in a rehabilitation, right? So you are ensuring that they can't commit the crimes again, but you're also trying to send the messages of if somebody is prosecuted, other folks can look at that and kind of change their behavior.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the messaging is important, right? When you look at an individual prosecution, focus on the individuals, put aside the corporate prosecutions for a moment, and you're at a sentencing hearing before a judge. The issues of specific general deterrence are paramount. There are many districts that we prosecute cases that unfortunately, notwithstanding the repeated prosecutions that are occurring there and the similar type schemes, you see the same behaviors, right? You see the same defendants in the white collar space, defendants who have the resources, right? Who had the resources to make a particular choice and chose not to. So it's often, notwithstanding what might be the perception of unlimited resources at our disposal and the data analytics team, we do have to be mindful of the cases we are bringing and the types of schemes we are focused on. And that's where data analytics and other experiences come to play. So when you see a scenario like, and I'll give a specific example, several years ago, 2019-20, in the healthcare fraud unit in particular, you see charges against hundreds of individuals And that is a metric, that is one metric. And that had been the trend, upwards, 100, 200, 300. In my first year, 2020, we actually charged half of the individuals. But we were able to use a different metric, and what we saw was our schemes. The schemes we were charging, although fewer defendants were involved, they were more complex, the telemedicine type case. One individual having an effect on numerous patients throughout the country. Ended up us being able to save the Medicare program $10 billion over 10 years, right? Even though we charged half the number of people. 20 million pills taken out of the streets over a 10-year period than before, right? These are different metrics, and we have to think about that because of the resources that we have. Why are we doing this? But the deterrence piece and behaviors on the corporate side matter as well, right? We're all focused on the integrity of the markets and people believing and trusting that the markets are not, taking advantage of individuals. So the types of cases and the sentences and the arguments before courts, they really matter, I believe, in a big way. So.
This topic of fostering a culture of compliance is really a common thread and something that we've been really encouraged on the cryptocurrency prosecutor investigator side to see that there have been tremendous improvements in industry over even just the past few years of companies really understanding and embracing this idea of the importance of compliance. And I think that's a combination of seeing the industry just generally mature, seeing the impact, deterrence, and other incentives of some of the prosecutions that have been brought where entities didn't have an appropriate culture of compliance. And also seeing how a failure in compliance really can hinder investigations of very serious criminal activities, and where you see victims of these large hacks realize that it's very difficult for law enforcement to effectively recover your funds if the funds go to one of the other big players in the industry that frankly may look a whole lot like your business. And when we go to them to ask for records about the accounts that the money was moved through, or about the due diligence that they did, or to ask them to freeze funds, their answers end up really dictating how successful we can be in many instances. And industry, I think, has really started to understand how compliance and the culture of compliance and specific procedures that they may implement really does have a measurable impact on the ability for us to clean up the cryptocurrency ecosystem as a whole. And that ability to recover funds is a really, really significant area of our work. And that plays into both restitution for the victims. We have, through the department's work, managed to recover billions of dollars worth of cryptocurrency that had been lost. And that's great, but there's billions more that unfortunately we aren't able to successfully recover. And it's important, one, to get the money back to the victims. Someone's experienced a significant loss. Also, to de-incentivize the criminals who are committing these crimes. A lot of it is very financially motivated. And when we look at where a lot of this money is going, for the hacks in particularly, many have been publicly attributed to hackers operating out of North Korea and who are using these hacks to fund their North Korean state activities. And we want to deprive them of the ability to use cryptocurrency to be able to fund the illicit activities of that regime. Same for individuals who may be located in Russia or other countries where, though we will continue to investigate and prosecute and attempt to bring them to justice here in the United States, it may just be difficult for us to be able to successfully get them into a courtroom in the US, and being able to deprive them of the assets that they have stolen from American victims, American companies, is really key and an important aspect to effectively policing this space.
That's one thing to hit upon. The communications across agencies, I mentioned earlier, we cannot bring every criminal case, and it's in all areas, whether FCPA, healthcare, or market integrity units. But there are, agencies like the SEC, there's foreign authorities out there. There's, in the healthcare space, there's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services that can revoke someone's ability to bill after the fact. I think more in the past, the difference is now, and local prosecutors' offices, the difference now from when I started till today is the amount of communication that's happening and the efficiencies that are built in to ensure that, to the extent we can't bring a case, we can get someone out of the system in a variety of ways that can either help toward restitution, it could help toward patient harm or individual harm in romance scams, et cetera, to freeze bank accounts. There's a variety of things and tools that I think people are more accustomed to and willing to utilize simply by knowing that they're out there and partnering on a bunch of cases on the criminal and civil side.
And I think it's important to also recognize the role of civil society, right, and corporations, right, in terms of some of it as well, right? You're not going to be able to stop all the fraud and bribery that's out there, but you know what? I'm sure some people have thought about, okay, I received a romance scam email or text message and I'm not going to respond to it now because I didn't think it was linked to cryptocurrency, but raising the awareness broadly in the same idea of increasing compliance within corporations is critical. My practice is primarily FCPA, right? The aspect of foreign bribery is, they say it's 3% of the global economy, which is $150 million in bribes every hour, right? When it is that big, there is no way that even 40 prosecutors can stop that type of global corruption that's out there. It has to be companies, it has to be individuals who are involved in that to kind of set up the shields, the structures, the controls to prevent it from happening.
Yeah. I would be remiss if, and I'm sure all of us have different perspectives on this, if we didn't bring up voluntary self-disclosures as part of that. It is effectively, come and tell us when you see a violation and you are better off. That is, for those of you that aren't familiar with that.
When I was a prosecutor, I said that too. I don't say that anymore. But yeah.
And on an initial instance, I can see the skepticism behind it. It is something that the department as a whole has really prioritized, and there have been some monumental changes in the policy across the board in ways that haven't existed in prior years. One of them being that now all the U.S. Attorney's Office communities, all of the litigating components within DOJ here in D.C., we have our own voluntary self-disclosures. And that was at the Deputy Attorney General's tasking. They vary a little bit, but fundamentally what you get is that if you as a corporate entity come and identify a violation within the ambit of each of what we are overseeing, so whether it's a fraud or a crypto matter, an export or sanction matter, and you come and disclose this to us, absent aggravating factors, such as like the egregiousness of the conduct or commonsensical things that we would all kind of accept as being aggravating, then you are, depending on which litigating component, looking at a declination or a non-prosecution agreement off the bat. And so, ultimately, yes, Nat is a little skeptical.
I'm gonna give a rebuttal.
No, that's totally fine. But that fundamentally exists, and the revisions were tasked because of something you pointed out, Nat, which is we don't see everything. And that is just the bottom line truth. This public-private sector relationship and partnership has to be real. Some of the greatest tips and some of the most heartwarming things that I've seen in the last 2 years in the Russia space is companies taking actions on their own, where they know through their compliance program that a certain shell company or a owner of a certain luxury item, be it a plane or a yacht, is on a denied list now. They're radioactive. And so on their own, they will go ahead and they will cancel an insurance policy. If you're a bank, they'll call in a loan. And these are very destructive ways in which it really makes the lives of these Russian elites, their proxies, very uncomfortable. And it has a very powerful impact in ways that I don't think many people appreciate. And so we get it. If you are a multinational company, you are not going to bat perfectly. There are going to be mistakes. We understand that. We want to help build out and ensure that those mistakes don't happen again. And that's the emphasis behind the VSD revamp. And that's why you'll hear every single time you've got a DOJ person talking, pushing for the VSDs. It'll take time, I get that, but it's there and it's been incentivized in a way where we hope people in the corporate community realize the tremendous benefits behind it.
And you talk about behaviors and deterrence, and that's itching to
I'll-
come out.
I'll-
But I will say this, we talk about transparency. This is another component of what we were just talking about. We put at least the fraud section, we put our corporate resolutions, we make them public, right? And there's a portion within the corporate resolution called relevant considerations that are important, right? Because it gives the public an idea of why particular outcome occurred, right? What was cooperation in this particular case? Timing of different issues. We put it out there, and the idea is that, it's not just deterring criminal activity from an individual standpoint. This culture of compliance that is real. Look, there are industries that really don't even know where to begin in that space, right? What are we looking for, DOJ? And it's our goal and our hope with time, and to perfect it with time, and to do things like this and talk more and make things more transparent, that it becomes more common and understanding, because it is a difficult task. It's against nature to raise your hand and say, I did something here. But it is an effort that across the board we're trying to push and make it as transparent as possible.
And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, because these policies are covered by a lot of different folks out there. But I would note that there's been a dramatic shift when I started in 2003 as a federal prosecutor, very different than now in terms of the importance of compliance, the incentives that are provided on voluntary disclosures. I think the pieces that are missed sometimes by the prosecutors is the incredible management time and attention that is focused whenever conducting an investigation under DOJ scrutiny versus internal. And at times, the lawyer and accounting costs are more than the actual penalties. And so the costs of investigation sometimes are things to be aware of on it as well. All that said, tell us about some interesting cases that you can publicly to give some sense of what's there. And we also welcome questions. But maybe give us just a quick anecdote or two of some interesting cases, and then I'd like to turn to the role of defense attorneys in the white-collar world.
Sure. So this is a spin-off case that has now been sentenced. We have a fully adjudicated case, which is a bit of a rarity in our line of work. It takes a while to get from investigation to ultimate prosecution and actually get someone into the US and then have them sentenced. But we were investigating a cryptocurrency mixing service called Helix, which functioned to launder money specifically for criminals on the darknet. So if any of you are familiar with the darknet, there are anonymized areas of the internet where groups of criminals have set up essentially drug marketplaces where you can go and search for any narcotic or other illicit good or service you can imagine and order it and have it shipped to your door and connect you with drug dealers all around the world, and you pay for this in cryptocurrency. One of the ways that we investigate who's operating these sites and who's selling the drugs is by tracing their funds on the blockchain, the public ledger of cryptocurrency payments. And in order to safeguard against this, one service that some enterprising criminals have set up are called cryptocurrency mixers. They basically take money from lots of different drug dealers, mix it all together, jumble it up, and then send it out to different people so that we aren't able to trace it. We investigated one such site called Helix. It was sort of the go-to darknet mixer for the a variety of darknet markets up through 2017. It was operated by an individual who lived actually in Ohio. We ended up arresting him And what happened when we did the arrest is that we were able to find a number of cryptocurrency wallets, including an encrypted hardware wallet that he had hidden up underneath his desk. But it was encrypted, and we weren't initially able to get access to the funds and the file that was on this wallet.
And a wallet it's not an actual leather wallet.
It's a file that you can use to store the access to your cryptocurrency. And so we wind up, this is right before the COVID lockdowns, and we end up in disputed detention proceedings, mostly centered on this issue of we can't get access to the funds in this wallet. We believe, and it turned out that we were right, there's $60 million worth of cryptocurrency sitting here on this wallet that we can't get to. If we let him go while these funds aren't restrained, then he may be able to use this money to flee the country. This story is actually not about that defendant, because what happens is he ends up being released, and several weeks go by, and we know the information about the address where these funds are sitting in. We just can't access it, so we're watching it, and we see the funds move. And we wind up back before the judge in an emergency hearing saying that the funds are moving. Turns out that the defendant's brother had gained access to the private key that was able to move the funds off of this wallet, and was able to, even though we had the physical wallet in our custody, was able to reconstitute a copy of the wallet, access the funds, started moving some of the funds out. Wind up back before the judge. Judge reads the defendant, the Riot Act. He ends up transferring the bulk of the funds out. His case has now since he's pled guilty. But the brother is fairly smart and sits on the funds initially. And so we know that the funds have been moved, we can't recover them. And it's several months before he starts sending them through this very complex series of transactions to another cryptocurrency mixer, out to buy a variety of different assets. And it's only through following the money at each step of the way we're able to see every single transaction as it's happening, but can't intercede to do anything. And fast forward, ultimately he, as many criminals do, sort of lose their patience and restraint and really wants to be able to spend this money, which was initially worth about $5 million worth of crypto, ballooned up to over 20 million based on the trading value, and wound up spending it on luxury cars, purchased a new condo, went clubbing at this club in Miami where he used the cryptocurrency to buy large volumes of cash that he then filled a bathtub and submerged himself in the cash, which it made for great sentencing material. The sentencing pleadings are worth a read. Ultimately, he did wind up taking responsibility, pled guilty, and was sentenced. And you do see how a lot of the defendants in this space are individuals who get access to these massive amounts of money. And as a prosecutor in this space, you really start to feel it. If we get victim referrals coming in sometimes, and it's like, oh, it's only $5 million. The value here is just tremendous, and you really see the corrupting influence. So this was a guy who had absolutely no criminal history, but just overnight got access to tens of millions of dollars literally sitting in his hand. It's kind of crazy what people end up doing with that.
Yeah. Born and raised in Miami, it's never,
It's not a surprise there, yeah.
Always the club in Miami.
It's something, yeah, it's special. So we'll take you away from Miami and we'll go to Silicon Valley. And I bring this case up because another theme you hear about is not just greed, but vulnerability and taking advantage of vulnerable individuals. The case I'm going to talk about is a case involving a president of a Silicon Valley medical company. And I bring this case up for a variety of reasons. One is because this was one of the first cases we charged at around the COVID shutdown, during the shutdown. And oftentimes people wonder how were we able to do anything during that time frame? Another reason I bring it up is because this case was one of the first in the fraud section that involved the collaboration between two units, our market integrity unit and our healthcare fraud unit. The president was someone who touted to the public that his company was able, with one drop of blood, this is not Theranos, one drop of blood, cure any or diagnose any medical illness. Sounds, I've said this to many people, and I see faces often, and they're just like, that's crazy. Well, people believed it. And oftentimes people believe things because the individual that's touting this is charismatic, has a wide scope or avenues to tout whatever they're selling. And in this instance, using social media, other platforms was important, but it was also at a time when people were uncertain about a lot of issues, namely health and medical illnesses and what COVID is. And I wish I could just stop right here and say it was a securities fraud case involving someone who touted the fact that they could cure or diagnose all illnesses, that their company was worth billions of dollars, they lied, and there's the fraud. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. And notwithstanding disclosures that were not made and lies that were withheld to a variety of agencies, what this company also did was take samples and tested for every allergy, right? So these allergy panels, usually go to a doctor, you'll get an allergy test, they're going to be streamlined, maybe a couple allergies at a time. This lab in Silicon Valley was the largest by billing of diagnostic allergy testing in the country in a matter of a couple of years. And what they did was they were telling people they had a test for COVID at a time when no one did, but they did apparently. And because of that lore and that lie, people wanted to provide samples. And what the individuals didn't know, that the company was turning around and billing Medicare, Medicaid for panels that were close to $100 million in a short amount of time. So it was almost two phases. It was two phases of a scheme: the securities fraud scheme misleading the public, as well as the COVID-19 scheme that were able to basically prey on the fears that individuals had at a time and line his pockets to the tune of close to $100 million. He was recently sentenced last month to 8 years. This was a case in the Northern District of California. And I would say, this type of case, but for the fact that we have a data analytics team, because this was one of those cases where, while we were in shutdown and, not understanding, how we were going to do this because it was unprecedented, one of the first things we did in the fraud sections was look at the data and see the behaviors of individuals, not just in healthcare, but securities and the markets, and what outliers there were. And this is one of those cases that stood out and ultimately allowed us to take steps to stop this fraud scheme. So there are many cases like that, but again, the collaboration within the section, the use of data, and just the common theme of taking advantage of individuals is one we unfortunately see often. I would say across the board, and we're trying to prevent.
I'll talk about yachts. And I bring up a specific civil forfeiture action against the Amadea, which is a $300 million luxury yacht. It's a super yacht. It's the size of a football field. Belongs to a Russian oligarch by the name of Suleiman Karimov. And the reason why I'm highlighting this case in particular is there's a couple of themes that come out of this action. One is if you're a foreign-based criminal and you're sitting in whatever country and you're feeling safe and you think there's no way U.S. prosecutors can do anything to make your life uncomfortable, civil forfeiture, which is relatively unique to the United States, and I'll talk about what that is in a second, is an incredibly powerful tool in the way we can really disrupt some bad action. And the other thing that I would really highlight here is the participation and the cooperation at the international level, which is something that has dramatically changed in a very positive way in the last 2 years. And if there is a silver lining in this horrible conflict, it is that the vast majority of the world are aligned in wanting to do their part, big or small, to help bring this to an end. And so one of the earliest action by the task force was to seize this yacht. And our legal theory was that a designated U.S. designated Russian oligarch was utilizing or causing U.S. financial institutions to process payments so that he can maintain his yacht, or his proxies were doing that. That's an abuse of our financial institutions. That's an automatic trigger of our sanctions. And so that yacht ultimately made its way to Fiji. Fiji is a very small country. And if you think about what was going through their mind, they had a United States seizure warrant request where we asked their government to seize this massive yacht and to hand it over to us at the risk of who knows what, of whatever pressure there may have been from the Russian government and others in the background. And they stood up to that. And it's a very powerful demonstration in a very public way of how smaller countries that you wouldn't think have a lot of skin in the game, of how they have dramatically changed their tone. There are countless examples of other countries who have arrested and extradited people back so that they can face criminal prosecution here in the United States. The information sharing that we have through the Department's Office of International Affairs is at an unprecedented level. And so if there is a positive outcome in this, it is that all of the allied members are looking for ways to have better cooperation in law enforcement actions, something that I know all of us have shared in our share of frustration in the past and see as positive development moving forward. But the civil forfeiture, which does not tie to a criminal conviction, which means we don't need a body here in the US, we don't need that person to be convicted or to plead guilty, we still have the ability to go after their assets. And so we still have the burden, because it is what differentiates us from the adversary, to maintain the asset until we ultimately get a final order of forfeiture from a court who states that the government has met its burden. This is not something new, this is something in pre-existing law, and it is our burden if we're the government and we're going to take your property away temporarily, that we ensure that it is maintained in the same level of quality in the event that the government is not successful in its forfeiture action. But it also ensures that we get the maximum value at the end of the day, if and when we are able to successfully forfeit it, so that when we sell the yacht, we're able to take that pot of money and return it to Ukraine in a way that helps with the reconstruction efforts. So it's a funny example that everybody likes to talk about with very powerful messages, and it's definitely one that I like highlighting more.
One of the themes of this Fall Institute really is about the questions of equity in an overburdened justice system, right? And there are questions and concerns about funding for courts, funding for public defenders, funding for prosecutors, Dag Monaco recently was talking about additional requests for funds, additional prosecutors. One comment that you just made there, right, is I would imagine, although I'm not sure, you guys are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties and forfeiture. Are you a net asset? Are you a contributor to the general treasury, or are you a detractor from the treasury?
So at least for us, the vast majority of the funds that we recover go back to
the
victims.
victims.
So while I certainly believe that we are making a significant contribution, we certainly are not a revenue generator in that regard. But I think that that's why we're here. The goal is to give funds back to the victims, and that's really the nature of the types of crimes that we are investigating.
Yeah, I mean, even the offenses, right, that we're charging in particular, there's mandatory restitution that needs to, the monies that we're recovering, they need to go back to the victims. And with all our resources, and we talk about follow the money again, there's a lot of work on the front end, right, that, in many of our cases that we bring now compared to, let's say, 10 years ago, I think we are better positioned than ever before that, once we charge an individual, let's say, we oftentimes have a parallel, whether it's a civil action, forfeiture action, or a criminal action, or we're seizing accounts or freezing accounts, because we just have the ability to do that now from an expertise standpoint, with the goal ultimately to provide restitution to the victims in whatever case that we're bringing. I think it's extremely important, and I know it's extremely important. And I know judges, at least that I've been before in different districts, that is a highlight. Some judges, quite frankly, will go and will be asking in particular where the money is and what efforts we've taken to either freeze the money, return it to the victims, et cetera. The downside and unfortunate side of this is, sometimes the money's not there. Sometimes it might be there, but we can't get it. These are just some of the restraints and constraints that we have. But David brought up the civil forfeiture piece of this. There are oftentimes civil forfeiture actions that we have brought that maybe without even a criminal action, simply because the asset itself at least provides some justice to the individuals or the entity that might have been victimized. At least it's something, and that's a goal that we want to facilitate.
I would note that at least in my practice area, right, FCPA, there are not typically identified victims or restitution, and so there are billions of dollars in penalties that are flowing to the Treasury as a result of that, right?
Yes.
So there are sometimes unidentified victims in these types of crimes on that as well.
Right.
I do want to open it up to questions, and then I want to turn to the concept of the role of the defense attorney in the white collar world, but I do want to open it up to any questions that folks may have. Yeah, sir.
Hi, Jeff Grant. Alan, first of all, thank you all for sharing all that with us. It's very generous. You brought up the one drop of blood case, which is really kind of fascinating. How often is it that, there are some cases that are all the way to the extreme, like it seems like that one was.
Yeah.
But there really are biotech firms that are trying to do the right thing, but maybe the technology hasn't caught up yet, or maybe the way that they're marketing it isn't quite right. How often do you find that you've done the investigation, but maybe at the end of the day there's some confirmation bias involved in all of that, and it's not really what you might have thought it was?
It's a great question, and I think it goes back to the basic principles of being a federal prosecutor, or any prosecutor, right? The discretion that one has. It's an awesome responsibility, and when done right, and the goal is always to keep in mind, and I touched upon this earlier about the criminal versus civil, and the idea of what the distinction is, and it's often not a major distinction, but how do we differentiate those types of cases? It's something that we all are, I don't want to speak for everybody, I think so, we're always thinking about. So when you bring up the biotech or cases involving maybe these larger companies that are publicly traded, that maybe have compliance programs, on its surface look to be legitimate and everything fine. I'm a prosecutor, and this is me individually, and just being at it a little bit. I try to boil it down, and when I try to explain things to jurors, I try to be simple and simplistic. And thinking about healthcare fraud, 3 commonalities are always there that I've seen. One, you need patience, right? There's legitimate ways to obtain patients, and there's illegitimate ways. And the common themes for illegitimate acquisition of patients involve money, involve patient populations that are being exploited, and the use of third parties, right? I mentioned FCPA cases, you have to have third parties. You have what are called marketers or community liaisons. Call it what it is, but there's a means to obtain patients that is not normal, right? And there's ways that we can identify those. You need medical professionals. And often these biotech companies, the way they recruit medical professionals, the way they engage with medical professionals is unusual. And that could be in the sense of how they contract with these professionals or interact with them. But that's a question, who are these professionals? And surprisingly, you often don't get a straightforward answer. But then it's also, you need medical records. And there's not one of these elements that are more important than another, but when you're dealing with a Medicare or a state agency or even the SEC, you're looking at how they covered it up, how the lie was covered up. And whether it's a certain filing or a medical record, you start seeing patterns. It becomes more complex and difficult, and we scrutinize it significantly. But what we have seen in these cases, especially these larger corporate cases, is that when you ask questions, very simple questions, who are they? Where did they come from? And that could be the professionals or the patients. It becomes alarming. This compliance plays a significant role here, and data. Data. The case I mentioned in Northern District of California. When you look at what they were billing for prior to COVID and what they were billing for after COVID, drastically different. And it doesn't mean, the data does not mean they committed fraud. It's just, it allows us to ask the question, what's going on here? And the culture compliance question is, a great topic because, what I've seen is that oftentimes compliance people in that role aren't asking that question for a variety of reasons. So we see it a lot more. It's surprising because of the outward appearance. But one last theme I always say to jurors is, it's a case, appearance of legitimacy, and for people to have kind of that mindset of, what's going on under the hood. But by no means does the data dictate, for me or any of the prosecutors that means there's a crime. It just, there's common themes that we've seen throughout the years.
One of my very first cases as a prosecutor was a scheme that they could convince people that they could turn coal ash into gold, right? So this was the scheme of a small, convinced a church group. They got about $500,000. We decided not to charge it on the idea of coal ash into gold because maybe they actually believed it, right? And so we couldn't prove that criminal intent from that. So we used a letter that they sent, which they said they had a contract with a power plant to get that coal ash, because we could prove that was false and we could show that intent was criminal. And so that is the line that I would go with is always, when can you show that they are actually not just stupid, right, but they're actually criminal intent, right? And that is one of those aspects of when is it criminal versus just misguided optimism that they can do something.
It's the highest burden, right? I mean, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And we're here to ensure justice is done, and oftentimes justice is not charging the case and using our discretion appropriately. So,
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Max Fillion. I'm with Global Investigations Review. David had a question for you. Wondering how you're feeling about the litigation road that you guys have ahead of you. You mentioned the Amadea case. I think last week, there was a filing we wrote up. Someone filed, I think, a separate complaint basically claiming that they were the owner of the yacht. I don't know how many other forfeiture actions have been open, but I imagine that there's going to be similar fact patterns. It's worth a shot. And so those might take a little while to play out. I'm curious how long you think they might take. And meanwhile, the yacht costs something like tens of millions of dollars to maintain. So I think there's a bit of a balancing of wondering how you feel about the sort of balancing of resources with, maintaining that during years of litigation, how you're feeling about that. And yeah, I mean, it's just a long road from seizure to forfeiture. And so I was wondering if you could speak to the challenges that kind of lie ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, I think a point that was raised that is a very good one is sometimes the right thing to do is to not take an action, and that is the most just thing you can do. I can assure you that every action that the task force and the department has taken to date has been done very thoughtfully and carefully. I stated at the beginning of my intro that I started off my legal career as an ADA, an assistant district attorney in Philadelphia. There are a lot of differences, but one thing that I can definitely state is, that's a significant volume-based type of operation, whereas the Department of Justice at the federal level, there's an extreme amount of discretion that is put into place. And so before any action is brought publicly, it goes through a significant amount of vetting, consideration, and thought. And so every action that we've taken, including the Amadea forfeiture action, was done because we feel very confident that at the end of the day we will prevail. Naturally, our justice system allows people to come forward and make claims, whether they are true or false. Irrespective of that, that's what makes us different than our adversary. Everybody gets their day in court. In due time, we're confident we will prove that whatever claims come forward are wrong and that we are in the right. With respect to the cost, as you know, even before the invasion, the forfeiture process requires the government to be good stewards of the assets so long as the process takes until we get a final order of forfeiture or we're told that we lost. And so that's an obligation and commitment that we have that's longstanding, and it's a principle that needs to be emphasized. And there are a number of different factors that go into how long a forfeiture proceeding will take. I can't predict that, but I can assure you that we are looking at all creative options to move along in this process as expeditiously as possible.
I would say one of the things that's important is that you don't necessarily always think about the cost benefit of bringing a case, right? I mean, that is not the only measure of justice in terms of how much it costs, would be my one perspective.
I thought claimants had to sort of pay the cost of the upkeep of the item and request that kind of upkeep. Is that not correct?
No, if the government's going to take an action to seize your property, it is on us because we have temporarily taken it away from you. So it's only fair that we bear the cost until there's a final order.
Does the DOJ need any more statutory authority to seize these assets? I know there have been some proposals in Congress to sort of make it easier for you to seize these things without a whole court proceeding. Or do you have any thoughts on that? And also, how much of these assets have made their way already to Ukraine? Because I know that's one of the goals, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So with respect to your second question, about $5.4 million have gone over from the Justice Department to the State Department for eventual transmittal. When we're talking about congressional action, that was only permitted because of a recent amendment that Congress made in December of last year that expanded the Attorney General's authority to take certain sets of assets for certain sets of violations, namely sanctions violations, and then transfer them over to the State Department for eventual use for the Ukrainian reconstruction. A $5.4 million is a down payment in our opinion. We've got a lot of forfeiture action. We've seized $500 million worth of assets to date, and we intend to prevail on those actions. With respect to kind of the larger expanded authorities about the forfeiture process, I don't have a comment for that right now.
Yes.
How much time did bathtub guy get?
Great.
I think he wound up with just around 5 years.
And I have a question for Mr. Lynn. This is a really, for somebody who is, not in this area, a really specialized area. How did you get into it? Did you choose it, or was it something when you went to justice, you were assigned to, you learned, or? Good question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a fair question. I think after being a local DA, my interest and motivation for moving to the Department of Justice is I wanted more complex, boundary-breaking, cross-border investigations like the ones that we do on a day-to-day basis. I think everybody, if you were to ask us, are kind of naturally drawn to our specific specialty for reasons. I know for me, sanctions and export controls, like the regulation of our goods being transmitted overseas, that always fascinated me. It's, especially in the last 2 years, has been an incredible opportunity to observe how these tools are used to protect national security, to advance our foreign policy. It's not that we are politicized in what we are doing, but certainly the focus of the priorities that are laid out with the creation of the task force or healthcare fraud strike force or the creation of a cyber crypto focused task force is because we identify this as an issue that should be given careful consideration and resources. And for me personally, it's just fascinating to see how we can use these not only to enforce our laws, but how we can get our partners overseas who are critical to any type of success for them to examine their own regulations. And that's something that's been just tremendous to see throughout this process, how not only us, but our partners overseas are rethinking the way they view their own sanctions laws. When, I think if you were to ask anybody in the Justice Department pre-February of 2022, you got a mixed bag result with our friends in the European Union on how they viewed sanctions. But now, as a whole, they are almost on point or on pace, if not outpacing, the number of entities and individuals that they are designating in sanctions as treasury. They are now putting up for consideration, making criminal sanctions evasion a crime, something that I never thought I would ever see. And so, seeing all that play out is fascinating. I never could have thought that this would ever be what I see 5 years into this, but it's tremendously been satisfying to see it happen.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I have two questions. One on the issue of money laundering and fraud in general. How do you all kind of deal with the issue of sort of imputed knowledge or willful blindness with that kind of issue? Because what we're finding sort of on the state level is we're able to trace the money to someone, but it's a dupe. We have a lot of victims becoming part of the scheme, and they have lots of money going through their accounts, and sort of, but not quite the, they told me they love me, so that's the first question. And then the second question, in terms of corporate compliance, sort of how do you all view sort of the difference between sort of somebody like a whistleblower or a employee or somebody coming to the department or coming to an agency in the department and reporting, malfeasance or something like that, and then the corporation kind of saying, we've done an internal investigation, you come to us, versus the corporation on its own coming to you and saying, hey, we've done an investigation and we found this. And
Yeah, I can touch upon that a little bit. So on the willful blindness side, that is, especially in fraud cases, that's something that, we are dealing with all the time. And, on the one hand, because of that, the documents, the evidence we obtain becomes critical, because we sometimes can't speak to certain individuals. And all we have are, the documents themselves, or, now with technology, the chats, the text messages, et cetera, that, there's no formula, but building a case to the extent we feel there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt, there are instructions that we are able to obtain in a variety of districts about willful blindness that equals knowledge, right? It's just a question as a trial attorney, could we bring a case strictly based on willful blindness? Absolutely. The law allows us to do that. Should we? And, presentation of a case matters. Having someone get up and take the stand and say, I did this, and so did that person. How did you know? Because I did it with him or her, is very powerful compared to an agent, let's say, who can talk about emails, but that agent was not part of the scheme. So we think about that across the board. The question you brought up about the people who are maybe part of the scheme, maybe obtain money, it goes to discretion. There are different tools that we have, whether it's immunizing individuals, and there's a variety of forms of that, or not, or just going down a different path. If you charge someone, it's a very important step, and it's not a question of can we, it should we, and that's again discretion and doing the right thing. On the corporate compliance side, the one thing I'll say, whistleblowers come in all the time, and it's one of those things I believe companies need to consider and think about, because voluntary self-disclosure is one of the key components of that, is whether or not whether the company had a pre-existing obligation to report it, but also did the government know about it already. And sometimes the benefits of a voluntary self-disclosure don't happen, or they don't occur because the government already knew about it. And one of the ways we know about it, besides data, et cetera, is someone coming in and telling us about it. So that's my comments as to that.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I don't want to end this on a dire note, but there are, I think, some fundamental changes that have changed both programmatically and structurally in the last year that companies should consider. There is the VSD, which we talked about already, but certainly the whistleblower, as pointed out, is something that we get as leads all the times. And when we talk about how cases start, that's certainly one of the ways. Something that's changed in the last year is that FinCEN, one of the regulators in this financial crime space, stood up their office of the whistleblower. And there are financial incentives, much like the SEC already has, where if people come and disclose information which eventually result in some type of a resolution, they get money in exchange. And so when you think about sanctions, when you think about Bank Secrecy Act violations, these are the scope of the types of things that now give whistleblowers even more motivation to come forward and disclose, something for companies to consider as they're doing the calculus of at what point, if at all, they come and disclose to the Department of Justice. But along with the VSD and this olive branch also comes the real practical change of the hiring of the first ever chief and deputy chief corporate counsels for national security. We are trying to align more fundamentally and concretely with our colleagues in the criminal division to ensure that there is better continuity in how these investigations are done, as well as the additional hiring of 25 new prosecutors just in my section of CES. And they're coming from a variety of different backgrounds, a lot with white-collar experience. And so 25 in 1 to 2 years of hiring is a significant amount of influx of resources devoted to this problem set. Another thing for corporations to consider as they're thinking about whether or not they want to disclose or roll the dice and wait until we find out first.
As we are almost out of time, I just wanted to go to part of this is the discussion of prosecutors and defense attorneys. And I would love to ask you guys, what do you think is the best aspects of the defense attorney that you guys are opposite, and what are some pieces of advice that you would give to them? Or what you wish they knew about white-collar prosecutors?
I think the best defense attorneys that I engage with kind of have a good understanding of the process. And in the crypto space, they don't need to be crypto experts. Having some basis in the technology or someone that they can consult with and ask can be really helpful. But the reality is that the vast majority of federal prosecutions are going to result in a plea, and a lot of those pleas have an aspect of cooperation to them, and thinking from a defense attorney's perspective of how you best set up your client to be able to earn a substantial $5K for a reduction of sentence based on cooperation can be really, really valuable. And the best defense attorneys who I deal with, once their client has decided that if a plea is what they want, really come to the government with a proposal and are creative about what that can look like.
Yeah, I mean, being prepared, I mean, it's come, I think, I mentioned transparency. There are an abundance of resources out there on voluntary self-disclosure, corporate compliance, even just, our indictments, things like that. We spell things out, and, counsel coming in and understanding these schemes, being able to distinguish, your client's situation versus someone else's, versus just saying, give me this, give me that, I think goes a long way. Also professionalism. This is an adversarial system. It goes both ways, right? As a prosecutor, it is a difficult job, and it's a difficult job for defense counsel. We understand that, or should. Being professional, having a conversation, and it goes a long way. And it's also just not just with the prosecutor, but there are people that are going to be in the room that might be on the government side. All of that is noticed, and reputations matter. Not just from fraud section alum. I mean, we've known each other for a long time, but people come in and out, and one of the first things at least we ask is who is this, right? Who is that? And with 200 prosecutors, oftentimes someone has dealt with someone who's going to be bringing a case here. So reputation matters. Being professional and prepared, I think, is very important, at least for me.
Yeah, I'm just going to steal that and echo professionalism. This is a revolving door. This is not you see us once and you never see us again. Reputation absolutely matters, and you're absolutely right. People talk, we all do, as I'm sure you all size us up as well, and our reputation. If we gave you a bad experience, if we made a misrepresentation to you, that fundamentally hurts our ability to negotiate in good faith, right, and vice versa. It is an adversary system, as pointed out. We're going to probably agree, if we're both professional, on about 90% of this stuff. It's that last 10% as to whether or not this ends up in a plea or we go to trial. And that's okay, right? We all have a job to do. It doesn't have to be personal. And that's why professionalism, above all else, I think is the most important thing.
And on that note, we should all retire to the drinks that are right out there. But thank you very much. Please give a hand for our panel.